Welcome. I'm Amy McClellan. I'm Dean of the Graduate Schools at Golden Gate University. We have degrees in MBA, tax, accounting, technology. So we've got data analytics, IT management, psychology, industrial organizational psychology, lots of degrees. We're interested in everything academic and anything to help professionals advance in their careers or get a promotion or a new position. Tonight, we're going to be hearing about retrocomputing, and I'm really excited about this topic. Our presenter is Huxley Dunsany, and he is a self-described lifelong nerd, which we all are at Golden Gate, with a love of outdated computers. Before we begin, if you have a photo of your favorite obsolete technology, feel free to share it by dropping it into chat. You can also post your questions in the Q&A button. With that, here is Huxley, and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for that warm intro, Amy. I appreciate it. And awesome. Well, I see the attendees list is starting to fill in. It's great. We've got a good full house already. We're just going to go ahead and get started, and let's see how this goes. So I'm going to begin with a screen share. There's that. And there's that. And somebody just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing the Retro Roadshow logo and the Golden Gate University logo on screen.
You're all good.
All right, let's get going. So I'm going to begin by just kind of picking up where Amy left off. As she mentioned, I'm Huxley Dunsany. I am the co-founder of the Retro Roadshow. And just saying that sort of demands the obvious question, what is the Retro Roadshow? And there's really a few different ways to answer that question, but we'll just make it pretty simple. The Retro Roadshow is my family, my wife Sarai and our son Ryle. And it started when I was a kid. In a sense, I've been collecting old computers and old gadgets since I was younger than my son is now. And it was just a hobby I've enjoyed most of my life. But a few years ago, we started hosting little informal events where we live in Alameda in the East Bay. And so over time, obviously more before COVID hit, but over time, these little local events that we were hosting at a coffee shop, and then as you can see in the photo that's on screen, some larger events like the East Bay Mini Maker Fair, which is awesome, over at Park Day School in Oakland. We essentially kind of evolved my personal hobby of collecting old computers into what you could think of as a pop-up museum. And we're really focused on making sure that it's always hands-on, always where possible. Obviously, it's a little tougher on Zoom, but this is something that I'm passionate about. My family supports me in making sure that that these experiences that we were creating were not just like walking past a bunch of dusty old gear in a glass box somewhere, but getting to get up close and personal with interesting and weird and obscure technology from decades past. And it is also really an inclusive community gathering. Is one of the most beautiful things that came out of our in-person events was we would set up a big display of various old computers and game systems and things like that. And it would draw people in who were in their 90s, and it would draw people in who could barely reach the top of the desk to get their hand on a keyboard or a joystick, and everybody in between. And it was just a really delightful thing to see so many people from different ages and walks of life and backgrounds coming together to learn about and enjoy and spend some time with weird old gadgets. But of course, we can't quite do that over Zoom. So instead, what I'm going to focus on tonight is a topic that I really love. And one of the things that I find the most compelling about vintage or obsolete old technology, and it's that, you know, we live in 2021 now. I'm talking to you guys over Zoom on a fancy laptop with a big screen and lots of gadgets all around. But this stuff didn't just pop into existence. The chain of events that led from an abacus 1,000 years ago to us being together on Zoom, there were a lot of false starts and a lot of dead ends and a lot of branches on that technical evolutionary tree that didn't end up going very far. And so tonight, what we're going to be talking about is 4 examples of lost or forgotten victories that were hidden underneath some of the biggest flops and failures in tech history. And so that's the topic we'll explore in 4 chapters tonight. And I want to begin with a quote, and it's a quote that will come back again later on, but it kind of sets the table for what we'll be exploring together tonight. And it's this idea that failure isn't the end. Failure is the beginning. And that was said by Tom Hershenson, who's a character who will pop up again in a little bit. And I really wanted to focus on this just to kind of set the tone for the session tonight, because this word failure, I'm going to use it a bunch of times tonight. It's a harsh word. And I'm using this word really carefully because every example that we're going to be discussing and exploring tonight, these were products or companies that were born out of a lot of good intentions and were created by incredibly smart and driven people who were doing their best to make something amazing. And so each of these stories is going to highlight an example where a company or a product failed in some aspect, but these are really success stories. It's just sometimes you have to dig a little deeper to find the victory that often follows a stunning or very public defeat. So that's the kind of introduction. And from here, let's jump into the first example, which is a really interesting company, the Osborne Computer Company or Computer Corporation. And this is a story that begins with a gentleman named Adam Osborne. And he's one of these characters where the more you read about this guy, the more fascinating he becomes. He had a really interesting early life. He was born in Thailand in 1936 and then was raised in England. And then he came to the US to earn his PhD in chemical engineering in Delaware. And that's where he was first exposed to computers, which in those days, the 1960s, a computer, depending on who you talked to, was either a gigantic piece of machinery the size of a small house, or it was a job title. A person who could do math quickly was hired to be a computer. But while he was at the University of Delaware, he started to get very interested in this idea of machines doing complex jobs for people. And so a few years later, he starts his own publishing company where he specialized in writing beginner-friendly manuals and books about computers, including a book called Intro to Microcomputers that he wrote himself. And it eventually sold 300,000 copies and was the book that Bill Gates and Paul Allen used as their sort of personal Bible when they were thinking about starting their own company, which of course later became Microsoft. And in 1975, in the first of many examples tonight where the Bay Area is the hotbed of interesting, weird things that are happening throughout tech history, in 1975, Adam Osborne starts attending the Homebrew Computer Club, which was an informal weekly or monthly gathering of nerds and engineers and weirdos and mathematics freaks who were meeting up mostly in Menlo Park. And while he was attending those meetings, he started to get the feeling that something really big was coming, that all these weird people who were going to the meetings were fascinated by computers and trying to create their own. So while he was hanging out at these meetings over Menlo Park, he's having conversations with people like Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, co-founders of Apple, Lee Felsenstein, who was an incredibly important hardware engineer, Jerry Lawson, who was the engineer who invented video game cartridges, and just on and on and on. The Homebrew Computer Club was a hotbed of smart people doing interesting things for fun back in the 70s. And so coming out of that awakening he had when he started attending those meetings, Adam Osborne decided, hey, I'm going to branch out from publishing. I'm going to start my own company. And so he launched the Osborne Computer Company in 1980. And he was really fixated on this vision. He had this idea that a computer could be a big hit. A personal computer could be a big hit if it came with some useful software, if it sold for under $2,000, and most importantly, if it were portable. And by portable, he meant, could it fit under a standard business airplane seat, which was the idealistic, crazy dream of portable computing in 1980. So about a year later, after working with Lee Felsenstein, that engineer that he met at the Homebrew Club, the Osborne Computer Company released what they called the Osborne One. It was the world's first mass-produced portable computer. And it met all of the criteria that he had been daydreaming about a year before. It sold for under $2,000, about 1,800 bucks. It came with a whole bundle of useful software, and you could wedge it under an airplane seat. So it hit all three marks that he was aiming for, that he was hoping for. And the Osborne one, to say that it was influential would be dramatically underselling it. The early reviews of the Osborne one were extremely, extremely positive. There was nothing like it in history prior to this machine coming out. Nobody had ever really envisioned what a portable computer could be, or what it could do for people. And it led to runaway sales, and this term that was invented to describe what was happening at Osborne Computer Corporation, they called hypergrowth. And it's an interesting term, hypergrowth. What does that mean? Well, in this case, it meant the company grew from 2 people to over 3,000 employees and over $73 million in revenue in about 18 months, all on sales of the Osborne One computer. And just to put those numbers in context, when Adam Osborne first drafted his original business plan for the Osborne Computer Corporation, his best case vision, his best case projection was that they could potentially sell 10,000 units over the entire 5-year life of the machine that they were envisioning being on the market. And in reality, they were quickly selling 10,000 a month, and they ramped up. They sold 60,000 Osborne ones in the first year alone. So to say it was a big hit would be an understatement for sure. And it was such a big hit that it quickly inspired, you could think of them as clones or copycats, other portable computers from some of the big names in the industry, like Compaq and IBM and Kpro. All of these companies and others as well rushed in because they all saw what was happening at Osborne, that there was this wild surge in demand from users, particularly business users, who suddenly saw there was the possibility of taking their computer work with them wherever they went. So lots of competitors sprang up almost overnight. Just to point out a couple, Compaq in particular is an interesting case. We won't explore their story tonight, but Compaq might be a name familiar to a lot of folks in the meeting this evening. Compaq's first product was a clone of the Osborne One that was architected differently. It was the first IBM compatible clone. IBM compatible was a phrase invented to explain what Compaq was doing. So this was just a crazy whirlpool of competition that sprang up almost overnight based on the success of Osborne's first computer. And as you might imagine from the topic of the session tonight, things didn't necessarily go great from there. So Adam Osborne was in uncharted waters. Nobody in business or tech had ever really been in this position before. And so in 1982, he was getting very nervous about this flood of very similar machines from all these other companies that were designed to replicate what they had done with the Osborne One. And so he wanted to drum up some confidence and excitement in the Osborne company's plans for their future. And so he gave some journalists what you might call a sneak peek at upcoming Osborne systems that were not released and were essentially in the drawing board or blueprinting phase. They were still being mapped out. One of them is what is on screen right now, the Osborne Vixen. And there was another machine called the Osborne Executive. And these were big improvements over the original Osborne. The Osborne One is probably best remembered now because it has the smallest screen you'll ever sit in front of. The screen is about that big. It's teeny tiny. And so there was obvious interest in portable computers with bigger screens and other enhancements. But within a few months, by 1983, Osborne's own dealer network started to hear rumors that Osborne Computer Corporation was on the verge of releasing some significantly improved or upgraded portable computers. So being the smart business people the dealers were, they did the obvious thing. They canceled all of their orders for the existing Osborne One. And so this machine went from selling 10,000 or more units a month to selling nothing. It just evaporated almost overnight. And by 1985, the Osborne Computer Company Corporation evaporated. The whole company collapsed into bankruptcy. And so they went from growing to 3,000 users and $70-something million in revenue to bankruptcy within 3 years. The rise and fall of Osborne's computer company it's so intense, you could get whiplash reading about it. And so to conclude this chapter, I want to kind of tie it up by summarizing some of the takeaways, the lessons we might learn from this brief exploration of Adam Osborne, who, despite his inclusion in this topic of tech flops and failures, I think he is an unheralded visionary. He was a pioneer, and he was really passionate about this idea of democratizing computers. That's why he wanted to make them portable and make them less expensive, because he came from the era when a computer was a giant machine the size of a building, and he believed that people could get benefit from them if they could just get their hands on them. And so he was really one of the first voices calling for regular people to have more access to personal computers. And he was maybe the first noteworthy person in the tech industry who really honed in and correctly and accurately understood that just getting computers into people's hands wasn't enough. They needed to be portable. They needed to be able to go where you went and do whatever it is you needed to do. And that making a computer portable was going to change everything. It would revolutionize society, revolutionize business. And he was 100% correct on those points. And third, he was also one of the first people in the tech industry who really understood that just selling some cool hardware isn't enough. You can have the world's most advanced personal computer, and if it doesn't have any good hardware, you've just bought an expensive paperweight. And so he was really the first pioneer in this field who really understood that the software is what matters. The computer is just the means by which you can get access to the software. And lastly, his one big mistake of openly discussing unreleased products, it fueled the collapse of his company, and it resulted in this phrase that is still used in business circles today, the Osborne effect. And you'll still hear about the Osborne effect in business classes. And, you think about a company like Apple, who is notoriously secretive. Apple spends more on secrecy than a lot of other companies spend on research and development. And it's not a coincidence. Apple was born out of the same crazy hotbed of tech in the Bay Area that Osborne Computer Corporation was. These people are contemporaries. They knew each other, they worked together, and everybody at Apple is very well aware of what happened to Adam Osborne and his company. And so when you think about why a lot of modern companies, particularly technology companies, are so aggressively secretive, sure, some of it is because they don't want their competitors to get a jump on them, but they're also very aware that the number one thing that prevents a customer from buying the product they need today is the fear that it's going to be knocked out by something better tomorrow. And so it's a really critical lesson that companies that we all know and interact with in some way every day are still running their businesses based on. So that concludes chapter 1. And now we're going to move to chapter 2, which is about a company that I have been fascinated with since I was a kid, running wild on the streets of San Francisco back in the early 90s. And this was a company called General Magic. And General Magic has one of the wildest stories you'll ever hear. It's pretty crazy. I should preface what I'm about to say by saying this isn't even the Cliff Notes version of the General Magic story. There is so much to this saga. There's actually a really good documentary that came out maybe a year or two ago that really explores this. So if anything I'm about to run through sounds interesting to you, you should check out the documentary. It's on all the major streaming platforms. But to tell the story of General Magic, you actually have to go back a little ways. And you have to go back to Apple in the early 1980s. So in 1981, Steve Jobs saw that some people within Apple, particularly a guy named Jeff Raskin, they were thinking up some interesting new ideas around desktop computing. And Steve Jobs, being the clever shark that he was, he kind of took over the project and immediately set about recruiting a dream team of some of the smartest, most brilliant engineers and programmers and artists in Silicon Valley. And he set them to work on this revolutionary project that eventually became the Macintosh computer. And fast forward a few years, 1984, the Macintosh comes out and it quickly becomes a successful product line. And so by the end of the 1980s, the original dream team that gave birth to the Macintosh, they were getting bored. They were not people who were going to be happy taking an existing product and polishing it a little bit and then iterating on that and iterating on that. These were creative minds. They wanted to do something new again. And so they started sort of an underground skunkworks project within Apple that became known as Project Paradigm. And Project Paradigm, this dream team, they were essentially sitting around in a conference room every day, daydreaming about what computing could look like in the future of the late 80s, essentially. And they were really fixated on this idea of pocket computing. And so Apple, being the very beleaguered and messy company that it was at that time, they didn't know what to do with these guys. So they spun them out and turned them into their own wholly owned subsidiary that became known as General Magic. And this is where the story gets really interesting. So these folks at General Magic, previously Project Paradigm, now General Magic, they became their own entity, owned by Apple for a short time before they were cut loose and just became their own separate company. And they were starting to really focus on visualizing what could it mean to have a pocket-sized, touch-sensitive device. And I'm showing on screen right now some of the earliest sketches from the Project Paradigm / early General Magic days. But these sketches really, I think, illustrate. These sketches are dated 1988 and 1989. And this device that's on screen right now, I mean, if somebody put that in your hand today, you'd think it's just a chunky iPhone. It's really kind of amazing how far ahead of the curve these General Magic folks were when they were starting to envision, if technology could get out of the way, what would be the computing device of the future? And expanding on that a little bit, here are some more early rough sketches from that imaginative early phase of General Magic, where they were daydreaming, what would it mean to a user, to a company, to a society, to have a device that would be operated by a fingertip or stylus, that would have a built-in camera, that could scan documents, if it could easily sync with your desktop computer, if it could read data and information from a variety of sources, and most critically, talk about pie in the sky thinking for the late 80s, what would it mean to have a device with all of those features that was connected to an always-on wireless network that followed you wherever you went? This was some science fiction stuff at that time, but they were really invested in the idea of, like, what could that even look like? And when I was doing my research for this presentation, I found the perfect quote that really, I think, hones in on just how clearly this team of geniuses was picturing our world today in their world 30 plus years ago. So this quote is from Mark Peratt, and he was one of the original co-founders of General Magic. And he was trying to explain what it was that they were imagining they could theoretically someday create. And so this is the quote he said: "We're imagining a tiny computer, a phone, a very personal object. It must be beautiful. It must offer the same kind of personal satisfaction that a fine piece of jewelry brings. And it will have a perceived value even when it's not being used. Once you use it, you won't be able to live without it." And if that doesn't perfectly sum up, I think, most people's relationship with their modern smartphone, I don't know what does. So moving out of this daydreaming phase, General Magic really takes off. They start to operate on their own. They're essentially cut loose from Apple. They become their own entity. They're operating in extreme secrecy. Again, Osborne, they knew what not to do. They were flooded with capital. They had tons of money from Apple initially, and then from some other investors in due time. And the dream of General Magic was to essentially let the engineers run the show. Apple in those days, and maybe today too, was known for having a very stifling bureaucratic management style. And these engineers who jumped ship and started General Magic, they wanted to see what they could do if they were free of all of the micromanagement within Apple. And so early on, they partnered with some of the biggest names in technology, Sony, Motorola, Matsushita, Philips, AT&T, and so on. And to say that this company had buzz in the tech and financial worlds would be a drastic understatement. They were so firing people's imaginations with what they could do that General Magic became the first company in history to have an IPO, an initial public offering, without a single released product or any revenue. They IPO'd just based on the potential of all the smart people who were working there and what the stock investing public hoped they might be capable of. And it worked. Their company value doubled in the first trading day and kept steamrolling from there. And after that initial phase of daydreaming that came out of Apple through Project Paradigm and then into the early kind of undercover phase of General Magic, they eventually settled down and started focusing on three general areas that they thought they could have an impact. And the first was Magic Cap. This was an operating system that they designed. It was designed to be deceptively simple. It was designed for handheld devices only, and it was designed for touch-sensitive displays. And all the visuals for Magic Cap, this operating system they cooked up, the visuals were done by Susan Kare, who is one of the most influential artists in human history. Everybody in this meeting and everybody you know has worked with graphic design work that Susan Kare was responsible for, ranging from the original Macintosh on through other things I'll talk about in a minute. And so this Magic Cap operating system was wildly advanced for the time, but it was incredibly simple. It just looks like a home office, and you tap the thing that's relevant to what you want to do. Second, the General Magic team started developing a concept they called Telescript, which is a software architecture that allows a low-powered device, like a little handheld computer, to push or pull data and information and jobs to or from remote servers. In other words, cloud computing, which was a term that the General Magic team invented to try to give a visual for what they were imagining. All your data just lives in this cloud over your head, and it just follows you wherever you go. This was science fiction. It didn't exist in this time, but they had to try to cook up a way to explain what they were thinking about. And lastly, they had another really clever idea, at least it seemed clever, which was to design hardware, but just to design the specifications, not to worry about getting too deep into designing the actual bits and pieces, farm that out to other companies who are good at it, like Sony and Motorola and others. So that was the buildup, but as you would already know from the topic of tonight's presentation, it's not all happy endings here. So pretty quickly, things started to go really intensely off the rails for General Magic. The first one was rapid growth leading to a rapid loss of focus. And so I've actually had the honor of speaking with and interacting with several people who worked at General Magic in this time. And to a person, they all used the same phrase independently, which was that the inmates were running the asylum. These folks were brilliant, and they were driven, and they were very creative, and they were so determined to get out from under Apple's bureaucratic management that they basically said, we don't have managers, we just let the engineers decide what to do. But if you've ever worked with engineers, you'll know it's like trying to herd cats. They all think they have the best idea at the best time, and it's very difficult to keep them pointed in one direction. So pretty quickly, you had dozens and dozens of smart people all reinventing the wheel over and over again, minimal budgetary strategy, and they never hit a deadline ever. Deadlines were just a vague idea that might someday become a thing. And secondly, a second big problem for general magic was that the very first hardware that hit the market that was running anything that general magic had created came from Sony. And Sony released a very short-lived line of gadgets they called Sony Magic Link. And these were what we might later have started calling personal digital assistants. They were little tablet computers running the general magic operating system called Magic Cap, but they were really expensive by early 1990s standards, and they were very slow. They just could not run the software at anything that felt like a reasonable pace. And so that really quickly led to the general public having a very negative impression of Magic Cap and all of its associated technology, because the only way they could interact with it was on these very sluggish Sony devices. And so that really damaged the public perception of what general magic was doing. And then as another punch in the stomach, their former originating organization, Apple, then released their own competing high-powered handheld device, the Apple Newton message pad line of gadgets, which themselves had some significant problems. The first Newton devices were also pretty slow and weren't super capable of doing everything they were hyped up for doing, which just further eroded public confidence that these high-powered pocket-sized computers were even worth pursuing. And then as the final kind of death blow to this whole concept, Palm came around and released the Palm Pilot and then its many subsequent sequels. And Palm did a very clever thing, which was go the opposite direction from Apple and General Magic by saying, let's not worry about science fiction stuff. Let's just make a fancy Rolodex you can keep in your pocket and have it run for a week on a pair of batteries and make it really simple. And so Palm immediately gobbled up the market, such as it was for these little handheld computers. And within just a few years, General Magic shut down. They were no more by early 2002. And Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, bought up most of their patents and intellectual property. To say that they ceased operations in 2002 is almost inaccurate. They were a ghost of their former self by the late 90s. So I want to return to a point that we opened with earlier. I used a quote from that gentleman I mentioned before, Tom Hershenson, about failure. And I want to give you guys the full version of that quote. The reason you should care about the story of General Magic is because it involves something fundamental. Failure isn't the end. Failure is actually the beginning. And Tom Hershenson, what I didn't mention earlier, is that he used to be the vice president of public relations at General Magic. So he knows maybe better than most. He had front row seats to what can go right and what can go wrong when you're right on the cutting edge of something amazing. And so by any objective measure, it would be reasonable to say General Magic was a failure. The company got a lot of money in funding. They partnered with a few companies who released some products that didn't sell very many, and then they went out of business. So in that short summary version of the story, you might come away saying, okay, big deal. They had some cool ideas. They couldn't execute on any of them. Who cares? But I really want to hone in on a couple of things. The first are those ideas. The list of technologies that were either born at General Magic or were heavily improved upon at General Magic is almost mind-bending. The abundance of funding and the lack of product direction was kind of a blessing and a curse for this company. It made them one of the most fertile breeding grounds for advanced technology in history, and it doomed the company to failure. But let's just take a quick run through on some of the technologies that were started at General Magic or were refined to the point of being meaningful at General Magic. Cloud computing, we already talked about that. My career wouldn't exist without the work that was done at General Magic. Software agents, which is a kind of a nerdy term, but it's, you know, when you tell your phone, hey, what time does Starbucks open? That's a software agent kicking in, doing that work, doing all the many tasks that are involved with finding the answer to that question. And that's a concept that was largely pioneered at General Magic. General Motors OnStar. If you've ever driven a GM car, whether it's yours or rental or whatever, that OnStar button that allows your car to reach out through a cloud service to let somebody know that you need help. That was a project started at General Magic that's using their Telescript software that we mentioned earlier. USB, the idea of a single connector that could talk to any kind of device, that was essentially born at General Magic. There were other companies doing similar things, and so it's not that General Magic was the only player in the space, but they had a connector on their gadgets that they called the Magic Bus, and Magic Bus later evolved into USB, the same technology that we all use all day long now. Software modems, which doesn't really sound that impressive today, but back in the 90s, the idea of having a device that could communicate with other devices over a phone line, whether that was a physical wire or a cellular connection, and do it all in software without needing special hardware, that was revolutionary. It was cutting edge stuff. They also pioneered the idea of taking a small touchscreen and designing controller chips for it so that it could be responsive to fingertips or a stylus, either or. They also were right at the forefront of developing an operating system that wasn't just adapted for a handheld computer, but was better on a handheld computer. They also pioneered the idea of application-specific integrated circuits, which is a nerdy way of saying special chips that can do special jobs in a handheld device or a high-powered device. They pioneered the idea of multimedia email for mobile users. And they were the first platform around that had multimedia or mobile networked gaming for mobile users. Streaming television was invented at General Magic. And they were also, I think, the first platform that offered an e-commerce system for mobile and remote users. So just a staggering number of advanced technologies were born at this company. And then the final legacy of General Magic are the people that worked there. And their golden age only lasted a couple of years, but the number of insanely brilliant and successful people that had a hand in creating or shaping General Magic is kind of mind-boggling. So I'm going to quickly breeze through. I had 3 more slides with more names. I just had to pare it down to some of the highlights. But Mark Peratt, I mentioned him earlier. He was a serial entrepreneur. He's founded a number of successful companies. Andy Hertzfeld was one of the co-founders of General Magic. He was a key member of the original Macintosh team, later took a director position at Google. Susan Kerr, I mentioned earlier as well. She's the artist who created all of the interface elements for General Magic's operating system. She also created the look and feel of the original Macintosh. She later worked with companies like Microsoft. She designed the solitaire cards that everybody's played a million times when you've been bored at work. She worked with IBM and Sony and Motorola, Facebook. She designed all of the iconography for Facebook. She worked at Pinterest. She worked for the United States Mint, helping design modern coins. And she currently works with Niantic. So anybody who plays Pokemon Go, you're playing a game that she helped to create the visuals for. Other people at General Magic, Joanna Hoffman, she's another unsung hero of the computer world. She was a key member of the original Macintosh team. She was the one-woman marketing department for the entire Macintosh product line for the first 1.5 or 2 years that it existed. And then she later went on to work at Next and then became Apple's head of international marketing. Megan Smith worked at General Magic. She later joined Google, where she led the projects that became Google Earth and Google Maps and Picasa. And then when she was done at Google, she decided to dabble in other stuff and became the first female chief technology officer of the United States. She was appointed by President Obama to that role. Tony Fadell worked at General Magic. After General Magic, he went back and worked at Apple, where he invented the iPod and the iSight webcam, and he led 3 different generations of iPhone development. And then later he left Apple and started Nest, the smart thermostat company that now belongs to Google. Andy Rubin worked at General Magic. He later left General Magic out of frustration that they weren't really executing on their vision of handheld computing. And so he started a company called Danger, which released a really innovative and successful mobile phone called the Hip Top, if you guys remember that. And then he later went on to start a project called Android, which became the the dominant mobile phone platform that we have today. Pierre Audemars worked at General Magic. He went on to found eBay. And Kevin Lynch worked there. He became the chief tech officer at Adobe, and then he went and joined Apple, where he led the development of the Apple Watch. And Steve Perlman worked there as well. And after he left General Magic, he started Web TV, which he later sold for almost $500 million to Microsoft. So this is just a sampling of some of the folks who worked at General Magic. It's really kind of amazing how many people came out of this company fired up to change the world. And what do you know, they actually did it. So that concludes the saga of General Magic. Let's move on now to chapter 3. I really wanted to touch on consumer trust, because that's a topic that is kind of woven into all of these stories. Osborne Computer Corporation lost the trust of their dealer network, and by extension their consumers, because they were hinting at products that were in the works but weren't available yet. And General Magic struggled to even build consumer trust after their early days, because the first devices that could get their technology into the hands of consumers didn't live up to the promise. And in the next example of building and then squandering consumer trust, there's no better example than Atari. And Atari, like everything I'm talking about tonight, has deep Bay Area roots. They started in the early 1970s down in Sunnyvale. And of course, they launched with the Pong arcade game. Pong, I'd be shocked if there's anybody in this meeting who hasn't played Pong for at least a few hours of their life. And Pong just blew up. There was nothing like it before. Nothing had ever come close to replicating Pong's success. And so they quickly expanded into some little dedicated consoles, just Pong machines that you could buy at Sears and other retailers to play Pong at home. And by the mid-1970s, Atari really wanted to expand their business into more full-featured home consoles, which wasn't really a category of product at that time, but they thought they could do it, but they needed more money. So after the crazy success of Pong, they sold themselves to Warner and raked in about $28 million in that sale. And then they fast talked Warner into investing another $100 million in funding, most of which went to developing a home console. A lot of money. And those are all 1970s dollars. I haven't done the math to figure out the conversion, but suffice to say, it's a whole lot of money. And so they started to put a lot of focus on expanding into the home market. And in 1977, they launched what we now think of as the original Atari, which at the time was known as the Video Computer System, or VCS. It was later renamed the Atari 2600 when they added more systems to their product line. They needed to give them different names, but for our purposes tonight, we're just going to focus on the VCS. And it was released alongside 9 different game packs, Air Sea Battle, Basic Math, Blackjack, Combat, and so on. And these were games that you can see in the box art there. Each one claimed to have dozens of different games within, but it's because they were counting slight variations on each game as a unique title. So the Video Olympics had 50 games, but they were essentially small variations on each idea. And I'm going to say something now that not every Atari fan will agree with, but I think it's reasonable to say that they pretty quickly figured out that compelling artwork and licensed characters that people were familiar with on the game packages were as important, or maybe more important, than having fun gameplay. And so by the end of the life of the original Atari, the VCS, they had sold over 30 million of these consoles. That's not counting all the other Atari systems that came out later, just the original Atari itself, over 30 million of them. And by the end of its run, a kind of mind-boggling over 500, I think 528 officially licensed games were released, and that's not counting dozens and dozens of unofficial games that came out too. And I really want to hone in on something I said a minute ago. I made the comment that Atari was kind of maybe a little cynical in the idea that a really exciting box art was maybe more important than the actual gameplay. And that's a harsh thing to say. There are really fun games on the original Atari, but just as an example of what I mean, this is the cover art for their game Starship. That's the great, like super exciting artwork on the box that got a kid all fired up to go spend their $60 on an Atari game. This is what the game actually looked like while you're playing it, which is fine. That's what games looked like. That's what video games looked like in 1977. That's nothing to be ashamed of, but the delta between what you saw on the box and what you got to play at home was really, really wide. And that led to some significant problems. So as has been a recurring theme in the presentation, they grew at a crazy rate. They were growing hand over fist, mostly based on sales of the original VCS. But they just weren't doing a whole lot when it came to quality control. And so pretty quickly, they were releasing full price games, $60 games in 1980s dollars that were terrible, like unplayably bad games. Maybe the most legendary of them would be E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was licensed on the Steven Spielberg movie. Great movie, horrible game. Or also Pac-Man, which was a runaway smash hit in the arcade, but the home version that Atari released was garbage. It was just no fun to play. It flickered constantly, it didn't have the right sounds, it was no good, it was terrible. And so by 1983, consumers just didn't have much reason to trust that they wouldn't be blowing their money on a game that was terrible. So consumer confidence in this new home video game market tanked. And many games that had been selling for $60 or more at the start of 1983 were being bargain bin clearanced for $5 or less by the end of 1983. Even good games, everything got caught up in this crash. And so they were desperate for tax write-offs. Atari ended up burying around 700,000 unsold games in a New Mexico landfill, and they ultimately reported $536 million in losses just for that fiscal year, 1 year. And this is just a few years after Warner had purchased them and sunk $120-something million into them. And so by 1983, the implosion of consumer confidence that was mostly brought on by Atari's quality control failures resulted in what became known as the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. And for a while, video games were mostly seen as a fad that had largely gone the way of a pet rock. And so that's when an unexpected new player enters the game, if you'll pardon the obvious pun, and that's a little company called Nintendo. And it's not always widely reported, but Nintendo is an old company. They date back to the late 1800s when they were selling Hanafuda cards. It's a Japanese card game, and that's what they were mostly known for. And then over the next 100 years or so, they branched out into mechanical amusements and early electronic games and toys. And in 1983, Nintendo released the Family Computer, or Famicom, in Japan. And it was specifically designed for the Japanese market, and it used cartridges, and it was a big hit in Japan. And they wanted to gain entry to the US market, which they had never worked in before. Nintendo had no presence in the US, so they explored a partnership with Atari, but that didn't go well. There was some really interesting corporate intrigue and backstabbing. I'll just hint at that. We don't have time to get into it all right now. So Nintendo kind of hit the brakes on their project to release their own system in the US, and they spent a year or two really researching what was going on with the US video game market. They saw the damage that Atari had done, and so they decided the only way to be a successful video game company in the US was to not look like a video game. And so they redesigned the Famicom to look more like a VCR or a high-end piece of stereo equipment. That's why you load an original Nintendo game in the front like a VHS tape instead of popping it in the top the way you might into an Atari. They were really anxious to not look like what people imagined a video game to look like. And they were super focused on restoring consumer trust in their products and in the video game industry as a whole. So all of their licensed games and accessories came with the famous Nintendo seal of quality. That was their statement that they're standing behind the quality. They can't promise you'll like every game, but they can promise that they won't just be garbage that you can't even play even if you want to. So to summarize, there are some lessons we can take away from Atari and from Nintendo. From the Atari side of the house, hypergrowth, that term that we learned from Osborne earlier, it is a blessing and a curse. You get the benefits of growing quickly, maybe even founding or establishing your own market, but you also have the very, very real risk of hubris and losing control of the quality of whatever it is that you're making. And symbiotic partnerships with organizations that have similar goals can be really powerful or really destructive. When Atari nosedived in the early 80s, they brought down dozens of other companies with them, dozens of companies who were making perfectly good video games, but they tanked the entire industry. And hubris is a common side effect of rapid success, and you have to watch for it. And finally, if you waste the trust of your customers, you're damaging more than just yourself. You can damage the entire industry that you're trying to compete in. And from the Nintendo branch of the story, they didn't enter the market until they really understood it. They realized that they were entering into a very damaged market in the US. And so they had to rethink how they were going to approach it to not immediately suffer from Atari's failings. And they were willing to adapt and change their product and their entire business model to meet the needs of their customers. Their customers needed to have faith in the product. And so it wasn't just enough to have a great product, they had to adapt it to meet that need. They stood behind their product. They put their own seal of quality on everything they sold. And they always looked for an opportunity to demonstrate that they respected their customers. To this day, you can call Nintendo or write them and you'll get to speak to an actual person. So they are really deeply imbued with that idea of respecting their customers at all times. So that concludes chapter 3, and that brings us to the final segment of our presentation. I'm keeping one eye on my clock here. And I want to talk for just a few minutes. This will be a slightly shorter portion, but I think it's a fun way to wrap up. I want to talk a little bit about a company some of you may remember, some of you might not be familiar with, but it's a company called Next. And Next has a really wild history that I'll be just kind of skimming over the surface of here, but if it's interesting to you, it's worth taking a little time to read about it. So the prehistory of Next actually, again, begins in Apple. So in 1976, Steve Jobs and Wozniak and a third guy most folks have forgotten named Ron Wayne, they start Apple Computer. And in 1981, as we mentioned earlier, when we were exploring General Magic, Jobs leads the Mac project, and that really ushered in that whole era of graphical interfaces for home computers. The Mac's a big hit in '84, and by 1985, Jobs resigns from Apple, or maybe not, depending on which version of the story you choose to go with. And after Jobs left Apple, he kind of flailed around for a minute. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do, but he knew he wanted to stay in computers. That's where his heart always was. And so pretty quickly, he starts a new company he called Next, which was very obviously named as a way of thumbing his nose at his former Apple pals. And over the next few years, Next designs some incredibly powerful workstations. These were bleeding edge technology that were not really designed for or marketed to home users. These were designed for higher education, colleges, scientists, researchers, mathematicians. John Helmer in the chat says that he did mathematical modeling in college on Next. So John knows exactly what I'm talking about here. And Next was really, really pushing the limits of what technology could do in the late 80s and early 90s. They were doing everything they could. They were incorporating all of the most advanced tech. They used magnetic optical drives. They had built-in Ethernet when that was very uncommon. Their displays were all super high resolution and so on. And these Next computers ran their own operating system that was called Next Step. And Next Step was way, way ahead of its time. Thinking about its competition in those days, it was super stable. It just didn't crash. It was rock solid. It was built for high-speed networks in the era of dial-up modems. It had the first online app store. You could go online and order a pizza if you were in the Bay Area and happened to have a Next computer. And it was designed to be a programmer's dream platform with a really deep library of coding and programming tools. It was all built on top of a variation of the Unix operating system. And it was just meant to be a beautiful sandbox for creative people to work on. And it was highly portable, meaning it could be tweaked to run on different kinds of hardware. And that becomes really important here in just a minute. But I want to pause for a moment and just take a look at some of the things that were created on NextStep. Even if you're not like me and John, and maybe you haven't ever gotten to play on a Next computer, the odds are pretty good that you're familiar with some of the stuff that was created on Next machines. Because it was such a dream platform for programming, a lot of really advanced games were created on Next, even if most people never played them on Next. So games like Doom and Doom 2 and Quake and Strife and Heretic and Hexen, these are all games I'm still playing today. I just installed Quake on my Nintendo Switch last night, and that's literally something that was created on NextStep operating system on Next hardware. Platform, John, this might be what you were referring to, but a tool set called Wolfram Mathematica, which is a insanely complex and powerful platform for developing mathematical systems that was born on Next. And then there was this little technology you might have heard of that was started there. It's called the World Wide Web. That was born on the Next machine as well. So this is just a very shallow sampling. I just wanted to highlight some things that you guys may be familiar with, but the catalog of tech that was built on Next is really deep, and it's pretty incredible. But in keeping with the theme of the evening, Next was, in some sense, a pretty big failure. So in 1993, Next could not make a go of it. They were losing money hand over fist trying to sell their own high-end hardware. So they dumped their entire hardware line and they pivoted to a software-only business model. And at that point, Steve Jobs was being mocked openly in most of the business and tech press. Next was seen as a dying company teetering on the edge of oblivion. In 1996, Apple was in terrible, terrible trouble. Their own operating system, macOS, was really creaky and aging, and they didn't have an exit strategy. All of their efforts to design a new operating system that would be more modern for the internet era had imploded. And so Apple ends up purchasing Next for $400 and something million. And after a few title changes, Steve Jobs eventually becomes the CEO of the joined company. In 1997, Apple and Next engineers have joined forces, and they essentially create Mac OS X, which is a slightly Appleified version of NextStep. And a few years later, Mac OS X is released, and it still looks like NextStep. If you guys were using Macs in those days, or if you look at screenshots now, they look shockingly similar. Apple put some Apple-style polish on it with the Aqua interface, but it's still NextStep. It's very obvious. And then a few years later, we get the iPhone, which is running a customized version of Mac OS X, which is still based on NextStep. And so to connect all of these dots, when you think about the colossal failure that was Next as an independent company, fast forward to today, and there's somewhere in the ballpark of 1.65 billion devices in active use on Earth right now and in orbit, because astronauts love these things too, and they're all running iOS or tvOS or iPadOS or watchOS, and all of that is directly descended from NextStep. And so again, Next was a colossal failure in most measurable senses, but the ideas were smart and they were able to navigate their way through these crazy transitions. And that really brings us full circle. Failure isn't the end. Failure is where things start. Failure is where things get interesting. Failure is where the possibilities are. And that is, with 30 seconds left in our scheduled time, where I am going to stop talking and type up my own website here. Ooh, I talked myself hoarse there, so I'm gonna stop my screen share. And I think I'm still on camera. There we go.
Stay on camera. My name's Sue Ann Hirschberg.
Right.
I'm the Program Director of Marketing at GGU. And Huxley, thank you. This was just so amazingly fascinating. And I feel so much better, not only about my own personal failures, but the failures of some of the companies that I've worked for and all the future of that. So thank you so much for joining us. If you have, as attendees have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we'll be happy to continue the discussion with Huxley.
I should say, just to interject one quick thought here,
Sure.
Sue-Ann. I didn't make a big deal of this throughout the slideshow, but every single product that I talked about throughout are things that are part of the Retro Roadshow collection. So when we're able to do in-person meetings again, we've got Apple Newtons, we've got General Magic devices, we've got more General Magic devices, we've got Palm Pilots, we've got Next workstations, Osbornes, Commodores, Ataris, all of it. So we're really looking forward to being able to return to in-person meetings as soon as it's safe to do so. But I guess in the meantime, we'll stick to Zoom.
I can't wait to see all of those. And some people did put pictures. You'll have to click on the JPEGs to see
Awesome.
some of the Pilot 5s and iPads from years gone past to do that.
Right on.
So we're looking for questions. Anybody have questions for Huxley? When do you think the next roadshow will be?
I'm kind of playing it by ear. Our primary home base in Alameda is a coffee shop called The Local, and they may be going through a change in ownership. And so I'm kind of waiting to see how that shakes out. So if anybody in the East Bay or Greater Bay Area knows of a good venue that might be a good and safe venue to do something like this, I would love to hear from you.
You can reach, and where can they reach you?
Oh, yes, I had it on screen a moment ago, but retroroadshow.org. There's contact info and more info there.
I think Golden Gate University would be a good place.
I think Golden Gate would be.
I'm ready when you guys are.
We're on second admission, so that's really convenient. We'll talk further about that. For the attendees, thank you so much for joining us. In about 2 weeks, you're going to get a URL that will give you a copy of this presentation, along with a little bit more information about maybe where the roadshow will be next. Again, thank you for joining us for our Innovation and Practice series. You can reach us at ggU.edu or reach Huxley at his email address. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Huxley. This was a delight. Just amazing.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate everybody showing up. Have a great evening. Bye, everybody.